And if you look at the war in Ukraine, it's almost like that debate over funding for NATO, where the US is disproportionately the biggest supplier of arms to Ukraine. And there's a really big question over whether that is pushing the war to go on further, whether we should be encouraging negotiation and diplomacy instead. I tend to fall into that camp. And I also wonder specifically if Russia will begin to treat us as a warring party, and that brings us closer to two nuclear powers conflicting.
Esto es La Inquietud con Garret Edwards, el lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Damos vuelta de página aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario. Tenemos un enorme honor, placer y privilegio desde los Estados Unidos de América. Ella es editora asistente en la revista Reason. Ha sido publicada también en The Wall Street Journal, en Newsweek, en The National Interest. Es politóloga, se graduó en ciencia política en la Universidad de Arizona, de University of Arizona, en los Estados Unidos. Está del otro lado acompañándonos para tener una charla aquí con nosotros en inglés, Fiona Harrigan. How are you doing, Fiona? Garret Edwards over here.
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Fiona. And you've been in Argentina before. Now we're doing it virtually, but you've actually been here in the country.
I have. Right before the pandemic started. I almost got stuck when the world shut down, but had a wonderful time in Buenos Aires.
And you managed to escape before we closed the borders and everything went.
Just barely. One of the last flights out.
You could have started an Argentinian life if you had stayed here. So who knows? What ifs and counterfactuals. Speaking about borders and immigration, which is one of the subjects that you have been covering at Reason and you have been writing for so long, what can you tell us about border policy in the US right now?
Right now, it's really interesting because I think we're kind of coming out of the pandemic in a lot of policy areas. Things like social distancing and masking policies are starting to float away. But immigration is one area where it's really stayed strong. Joe Biden inherited Donald Trump's immigration policy, and Donald Trump instituted this policy at the border called Title 42, through which federal immigration officials can kick out people who are trying to cross the border from Mexico into the United States. Biden kept that up, and by now we've carried out about 2 million expulsions. So immigration across the border has really dwindled over the course of the pandemic. He has tried to lift that order recently. It took him a long time, but several states sued to keep it in place. So the border at the moment is pretty closed. It actually looks very similar to what it did under Trump. And there have been a lot of restrictions on immigration of all forms, things like refugee admissions, high-skilled worker visas, temporary worker visas, to the extent that the pandemic is really still active and really still shaping immigration policy in the US.
That's really interesting, Fiona, because you were comparing two different political parties, two different administrations, Trump and Biden, but things seem to be marked by the pandemic and they don't seem to be changing anytime soon then.
Yeah, that's right, to a degree. There's kind of this political debate in the US over whether Biden's a moderate, who he's actually crafting policy for, because he was elected as a Democrat, obviously, but as a moderate Democrat. And a lot of his immigration policy being so similar to Trump, you'd think would be kind of well received by Trump voters, by Republicans on the right, but that's not true. It's essentially just an immigration policy that's made everyone unhappy, with Republicans saying that he's presiding over an open border, which is untrue, and Democrats saying that he's shut down immigration entirely, which also isn't completely true, but it's closer to true.
So there's the truth and there's the narrative. What's the narrative behind all of this right now in the US?
The narrative behind all of this really, really depends on the outlet. I think immigration has become so deeply politicized. It's always been a political issue, despite us being a nation of immigrants, so to speak. But especially now, especially with the midterm elections coming up, and then these debates over who's going to run for president in the next election. Border states are taking their own measures, even though the federal government is the body that controls immigration laws specifically. They're sending immigrants on buses to Washington, D.C. now. So there really is this weaponization of migration and this view of it as an invasion, right? Invasion is a word you hear a lot now in immigration narratives. And by and large, these are peaceful people who want to come here to work. And given that we have a labor shortage, I think a lot of people in the libertarian camp where I come from think we should be letting people in. So it's been really disappointing to see, and it's having bad effects on migrants.
So many interesting threads there, Fiona. You just said a nation of immigrants. Argentina can completely relate to that. So if it's at least an image that the US projects and the one that Argentina also has in its history, is this an issue that it's going to be important in the midterm elections that you mentioned, immigration and policy?
I think so. I think it's going to be very, very important because it's kind of turned into this thing where Republican candidates contrast themselves with Biden. They say the federal government can't handle immigration. Immigration is an issue. It's an invasion, they say, that affects every single state. So you even see people as far away as South Dakota, which almost borders Canada, saying, well, I need to handle immigration. So I think with that in mind, these politicians are going to campaign on that as an issue, saying the White House doesn't care about immigration, so I will vote for me and I'll be strong on this issue. For better or worse, it's going to waste taxpayer dollars because these are very expensive policies that the federal government was already spending a lot on. So it's just going to be transferred to the states now.
You also mentioned the weaponization of immigration, the word invasion. Is this something that goes across both parties in some sense?
I wouldn't say so necessarily. I think Democrats are bad on immigration for very different reasons than Republicans are bad on immigration, right? Republicans are anti-immigrant in a lot of ways. Not every politician, obviously. Democrats tend to be, less receptive to incremental change, right? When we talk about legislation, we say, okay, we can legalize this small set of immigration. Sometimes there's a debate over whether we should be going bigger. And that's when you lose Republican support that you might otherwise have on issues like, letting more PhD students into the country or letting in political dissidents from China or Russia. So I think that everybody's failing to reach an appropriate compromise and everybody deserves some blame.
You are always following the US foreign policy. You are also following what's going on in Ukraine. What's your take on all of this?
I think everything that happens in Ukraine is to a degree bringing the US further into European security. And there's been this big debate over whether the US is spending too much on European security, whether we're kind of carrying NATO. And those are really, really big questions. I think I agree with the assertion that Europe should be spending more on its defense. And if you look at the war in Ukraine, it's almost like that debate over funding for NATO, where the US is disproportionately the biggest supplier of arms to Ukraine. And there's a really big question over whether that is pushing the war to go on further, whether we should be encouraging negotiation and diplomacy instead. I tend to fall into that camp. And I also wonder specifically if Russia will begin to treat us as a warring party. And that brings us closer to two nuclear powers conflicting. We just got news that CIA officials are helping Ukrainian officials in Kyiv, which is a pretty serious step. And it's a line that I think a lot of people who are anti-war worried would come. So with that combination of things, we're pretty actively involved in the Ukrainian war, which I'm very concerned about.
You also mentioned Russia and you put it on the map. And some people like to think that we are in the middle of the 80s or the 70s again. Why do they want to go back to some kind of pre-fall of the Berlin Wall world?
I think I wouldn't say there's a tendency to look for an enemy, but we definitely do have global enemies as the United States. We like to instigate to a degree. I think China is a much bigger threat geopolitically than Russia is. Russia is not economically powerful, especially now after so many sanctions have been heaped on it by Western nations. And I think the fact that Ukraine has held them off for so long really solidifies that they're not a major threat, Ukraine being so much smaller. So I think Americans who are pushing for some kind of Cold War return do so at their own risk. It'll exacerbate things like, trade battles and tariff wars and all of that stuff. And it'll alienate Russians who we should otherwise be welcoming, right? This is a problem with the regime and not the actual Russian people. But so often this kind of opposition to Russia turns into opposition to Russians.
A new contender appeared, China's appears as well, and you could argue generalizing that China has a strong influence from Panama downwards, and the US has a stronger influence from Panama onwards, if you look at the map. What do you think is going to happen with China in the next few years regarding the US?
With China, I'm concerned because you see Republicans and Democrats falling into the same trends of pushing trade wars and pushing things like strategic ambiguity with Taiwan, which, you know, historically we've been kind of ambiguous about our role. But I think with especially some of these elections coming up and some of the candidates that could be running, that we might lose some of that we might just start poking the bear, so to speak. And that's really, really concerning because, again, China has a great population, it has great GDP, and both of those are really problematic when we think about conventional warfare. I don't think that we're going to go to war. I wouldn't put money on it, but I do think that we're likely to see some kind of low-scale economic battling at the very least, kind of like what Trump has done with tariffs and trade wars.
There was one word you used before, libertarian. How's the libertarian movement in the US?
Unhealthy. I would say that no political party right now is without its issues, and libertarians are no exception. I also think it's important to differentiate between the Libertarian Party, obviously, and libertarians with a little L. The Libertarian Party just went through a big leadership change where now it tends to lean further to the right, especially on issues that I care about, like immigration and bigotry and all of that stuff, right? So that gets to be controversial. I still agree with them on things like foreign policy, that we shouldn't be involved in wars and that people should be free to live as they choose. But on balance, there isn't really a great electoral mechanism for libertarians who fall in my camp. I do hope, though, that we can kind of come to a consensus, that we can agree on certain things and actually be viable. But at this point, I don't think we're electing anybody anytime soon nationally.
You just also said something really, really interesting there, Fiona, because there's sometimes this weight or this expectation from outside the US, trying to get the US to be kind of a beacon for everybody else when they also have their own issues inside, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. Could you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't.
There's this expectation from outside the US for the US to be a beacon for things and to like be a guardian when they also have to deal with their own stuff inside their own walls.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. There's this saying, make sure your own house is clean before you criticize somebody else's. And when we think about things like political dissidents, you know, we criticize Russia and China for being so just punitive toward people who speak against the regime. Meanwhile, Edward Snowden hasn't been allowed in our country for years. That sort of thing. It just screams hypocrisy. And I think until we reform certain aspects of our civil society and how dissidents are treated and how we punish crimes and our prison system, right? You name the aspect of our treatment and our prosperity. I think it's very difficult for us to convey that example, which isn't to say that I'm not proud to be American, that I'm not hiding my nationality when I travel out of the country or something. But I do think that it's a constant experiment, right? We're always trying to be better, and it's good to always be trying to be better.
You studied political science, you're a political scientist. What do you think is the most important thing that you got from the textbooks that you can apply in real life now when analyzing politics?
I think something that I really valued from my education, and I studied international relations. I did a lot of study of terrorist groups and kind of evil regimes and bad states and bad state actors specifically. And something that my professors always emphasized is that actors are not irrational. And I think there's an prescription, a tendency kind of to see the people we disagree with as irrational, whereas it's really important to see the thought process that goes into these things. And you can apply that internationally or domestically, right? I don't agree with Republicans or Democrats on so many things, but at the very least, I can see where they come from and I can see how they reason their way through an argument and actually come to a conclusion policy-wise. That's something that I really, really valued. And I think something that's allowed me to be a little more thoughtful and deliberate with my writing at Reason, where I work, my magazine.
I'm a big fan of the work at Reason and of the people there. What can you tell us for an audience that maybe is not that aware of what Reason is doing over there?
Yeah, so it's the primary libertarian publication, which means we focus on free minds, free markets, and how people live their lives, both in spite of government intervention and after government intervention, the ill effects of government policies, and how people create freedom for themselves when that freedom doesn't exist. I primarily cover immigration and foreign policy, so I write a lot about the people who can't get into the country, have a difficult time actually prospering here, can't secure a visa because of government inefficiency or harm in general. And then I also write about war. So I've been covering Ukraine, I've been Yemen, I covered Afghanistan pretty heavily, but other people on our staff do everything from drug policy to criminal justice to education reform. So it's really a catch-all for a lot of these issues, and your right to forge your own path, right, to live individually in the absence of government intervention, which is something that not a lot of outlets are willing to do. We defend a lot of things that not many people defend.
And great videos as well, let me add to that, because recent videos are great. So the last two questions, and I will not steal any more time of you today, Fiona. The penultimate question has to do with the Patriots. Are you excited for the season that is coming next in a few months?
I'm very excited. You know, I'm sad my dear Tom Brady left, but at the very least, I think we're in for a good season, right? Great staff, great coaching, and our new quarterback is a stud. So I'm excited.
Perfect. I hope the same as well, because I'm also a Pats fan. And the last question we ask out of our every interview, we asked it. So the name of the show is La Inquietud in Spanish. It's a pun. It can mean a lot of things in Spanish, but in English, we just have one version of the question. What makes Fiona Harrigan restless?
I think something that makes me restless, especially when I think about immigration and when I think about the things that I write about with immigration, is just talking to these people who see my country as so much better than it often can be. Right. I was talking with a lot of people from Afghanistan last year, and every single one of them talked about America as this beacon of hope and freedom. And I think that's something that's really important for me to remember as I do my coverage. So really the thing that makes me restless, you know, makes me really want to keep doing what I'm doing and makes me want to write stories and jump into action and just cover these things is how many people want to be here and how valuable they think an American life is, the livelihood that you can have here. And that's the thing that makes me really proud and something that makes me want to help other people come here and prosper and live that way.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for joining us today. A great hug from Argentina.
Thank you very much. Had a great time.
Teníamos a Fiona Harrigan aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.